Ideas govern societies long after personalities fade, and the American Republic now confronts a quiet but consequential question: whether its citizens still believe self-government requires self-restraint. The moment is not defined by a single figure or controversy, but by a climate in which attention is currency, and indignation is mistaken for principle. A republic does not decay through sudden catastrophe. It erodes through habits that dull judgment and reward excess. This is not the language of alarmism, but of historical observation, confirmed repeatedly by nations that mistook noise for vitality. James Madison understood that the gravest threats to liberty arise not from tyranny alone, but from faction untethered from reason. The Constitution, therefore, presumes citizens capable of moderation, institutions sturdy enough to channel ambition, and leaders mindful that power is borrowed, never owned. When those assumptions weaken, politics becomes performative and governance theatrical. The result is not energy but entropy, a constant motion producing diminishing returns. What troubles the present moment is not merely coarseness of speech or theatrical displays of grievance, but the quiet normalization of excess. Outrage becomes a civic ritual, repeated until it loses meaning. While seriousness is treated as an affectation, the Republic's great inheritance, deliberation, compromise, and patience, is displaced by immediacy and moral exhibitionism. The noise grows louder precisely as understanding grows thinner. History offers no exemption from consequence. Republics do not collapse because citizens disagree. They falter when disagreement is stripped of proportion and humility. The Roman Senate did not fall because of passion alone, but because passion replaced judgment as the currency of public life. Likewise, American self-government depends less on winning arguments than on preserving the habits that make argument possible. This moment, then, invites neither despair nor celebration, but reflection. The question before us is not who offends whom, but whether the civic muscles required for liberty are being exercised or allowed to atrophy. The answer will not be found in personalities, but in the quieter discipline of citizenship itself. Such discipline demands patience, memory, humility, courage, and an unglamorous devotion to institutions that outlast ambition, anger, and applause over time. The American constitutional order was never designed to be self-sustaining through goodwill alone. It depends, instead, on institutions strong enough to restrain ambition, yet modest enough to command trust. What we are witnessing today is not merely political conflict, but the slow erosion of institutional gravity, the invisible force that once oriented public behavior toward continuity, seriousness, and restraint. Institutions derive authority not from charisma but from accumulated legitimacy. They function when citizens believe that rules apply even when inconvenient, that processes matter even when outcomes disappoint. Over time, however, institutions can be hollowed out not by open assault but by neglect, ridicule, and strategic contempt. When public figures treat norms as optional and constraints as inconveniences, they teach citizens that institutions are obstacles to be overcome rather than inheritances to be stewarded. This erosion rarely announces itself dramatically. It arrives incrementally through the casual dismissal of procedures, the personalization of power, and the reduction of governance to spectacle. The modern political ecosystem accelerates this decay by rewarding immediacy over reflection. Algorithms do not reward prudence, they reward provocation. Institutions that once filtered impulse now amplify it, leaving the public square saturated with noise but starved of deliberation. History provides sobering parallels. The Roman Republic did not fall when its laws vanished. It fell when those laws were repurposed as instruments of faction. Offices became prizes, not trusts. Loyalty shifted from institutions to personalities. The language of civic duty gave way to the rhetoric of grievance. None of this required villainy, only the gradual normalization of excess and the quiet abandonment of restraint. American institutions were designed precisely to resist this gravitational pull. The separation of powers, federalism, and an independent judiciary were meant to slow politics down, to frustrate impatience, and to force compromise. These mechanisms presuppose citizens who understand that frustration is not a flaw but a feature of liberty. When impatience becomes intolerable, institutions are blamed for functioning as designed. The danger, then, is not simply institutional weakness but institutional disbelief. When citizens no longer expect institutions to behave honorably, they cease demanding honor from themselves. Cynicism becomes a shortcut, absolving individuals from the labor of civic responsibility. Yet cynicism, unlike skepticism, is corrosive. It dissolves the moral glue that holds a pluralistic society together. The erosion of institutional gravity does not announce collapse, but it alters the terrain upon which politics occurs. Gravity, once lost, cannot be commanded back through outrage or decree. It must be rebuilt through habits of seriousness, respect for process, and a renewed understanding that liberty survives only where discipline is voluntarily embraced. Without that discipline, power drifts toward those most willing to exploit impatience, and history suggests they are rarely the ones most fit to govern. Power, when unmoored from restraint, rarely announces itself as tyranny. It arrives instead as efficiency, urgency, and moral certainty. The modern political environment rewards these qualities not because they are virtuous, but because they are legible, emotional, and easily monetized. What once required persuasion now requires only attention. In this transformation lies one of the most consequential shifts in American public life. Incentives have replaced judgment as the primary currency of influence. In earlier eras, ambition was tempered by institutional friction, the slowness of communication, the weight of party structures, and the prestige of deliberative bodies imposed costs on recklessness. Today, those frictions have thinned. Political actors operate in an economy of instantaneous reaction. Where visibility is success and outrage is liquidity, the reward structure encourages maximalism. Sharper accusations, starker language, ever more theatrical displays of conviction, moderation, once a virtue, is now algorithmically disfavored. This is not merely a technological story, but a moral one. Incentives shape character over time. When public life rewards those who provoke rather than persuade, it cultivates habits of mind hostile to self-restraint. Leaders learn that attention is power, and citizens learn that emotional affirmation is a substitute for civic engagement. The result is a politics increasingly detached from the slow work of governing and increasingly addicted to spectacle. Economists have long understood that incentives matter more than intentions. A system that rewards outrage will reliably produce it, regardless of the moral aspirations of its participants. This is not a conspiracy, but a predictable outcome of human behavior under certain conditions. When applause replaces accountability, the temptation to perform rather than govern becomes nearly irresistible. The danger is compounded when moral language becomes a weapon rather than a guide. Accusation substitutes for argument, and righteousness becomes a shield against scrutiny. In such an environment, politics ceases to be a means of collective problem solving and becomes instead a theater of moral exhibitionism. Each side claims virtue, neither practices restraint. The public, caught in the crossfire, grows cynical, mistaking exhaustion for wisdom. Yet the most corrosive effect of this incentive structure is its impact on agency. Citizens are subtly trained to outsource judgment to personalities who promise certainty. Complexity becomes suspect, nuance is treated as weakness. In this climate, the very habits necessary for self-government, patience, curiosity, humility, atrophy from disuse. History again offers instruction. Republics rarely fall because citizens desire tyranny. They fall because citizens tire of the burdens of liberty. When governance becomes exhausting, the allure of simple answers grows. The tragedy is that such answers, while emotionally satisfying, erode the very freedoms they claim to defend. A society that wishes to remain free must therefore interrogate not only its leaders but the incentives it constructs for them. Power does not corrupt in isolation. It responds faithfully to the environment in which it operates. If that environment rewards excess, excess will flourish. Reform, then, begins not with denunciation but with redesign, with the patient work of aligning incentives with the virtues a republic requires. The political economy of outrage did not emerge accidentally. It is the predictable offspring of a culture that has fused commerce, communication, and identity into a single, restless marketplace. In this marketplace, attention is not merely sought, it is harvested, refined, and monetized. What was once civic participation has been repackaged as consumer behavior, with citizens invited not to deliberate but to subscribe, donate, signal, and react. The result is a politics that increasingly resembles a commercial transaction rather than a moral undertaking. Markets, when properly bounded, are extraordinary engines of prosperity and innovation. But markets are amoral instruments. They require moral architecture. Adam Smith understood this well. His concern was never with self-interest alone, but with the moral sentiments that discipline it. When those sentiments erode, markets cease to serve society and begin instead to shape it in their own image. Politics, when absorbed into this logic, becomes performative and predatory rather than deliberative and humane. The monetization of outrage exemplifies this distortion. Emotional intensity is now a commodity traded for clicks, donations, and loyalty. The more aggrieved the message, the more profitable it becomes. This creates a perverse incentive structure in which moderation is economically irrational and escalation is rewarded. Political communication, once aimed at persuasion, now functions as a form of extraction, harvesting fear, resentment, and tribal loyalty for material gain. This transformation alters not only behavior but expectations. Citizens are subtly trained to experience politics as a series of emotional transactions rather than a shared civic enterprise. They are encouraged to see themselves as consumers of affirmation rather than stewards of a common life. In such an environment, disappointment becomes betrayal, compromise becomes weakness, and disagreement becomes evidence of malice. The consequences are not confined to rhetoric. When political movements rely on constant mobilization to sustain financial and emotional engagement, they become structurally incapable of resolution. Peace, stability, and incremental progress are bad for business. Crisis, by contrast, is endlessly renewable. Thus, even success must be narrated as failure to preserve the emotional economy upon which the enterprise depends. This dynamic corrodes trust not only in leaders but in the very possibility of good faith. Citizens learn to suspect manipulation everywhere, even when none exists. Paradoxically, the skepticism does not produce independence, it produces dependency on familiar voices that validate one's anxieties. The result is a population both cynical and captive, mistrustful yet loyal, disillusioned yet emotionally invested. The founders feared factions not because disagreement is dangerous, but because factions untethered from the common good become engines of domination. When political identity becomes a commodity, citizens are no longer participants in self-government, but raw material in a perpetual campaign. Liberty in such a system becomes rhetorical decoration rather than lived reality. A free society cannot endure if its citizens are trained to confuse consumption with citizenship. The remedy is not censorship or moral panic, but a reassertion of boundaries between persuasion and manipulation, engagement and exploitation. Markets must once again serve civic life rather than consume it. Without such restraint, the Republic risks becoming a marketplace of passions, rich in noise but poor in self-government. The Constitution was never intended to be a rhetorical instrument, wielded to sanctify passion or justify impulse. It was designed instead as a discipline, an architecture of restraint meant to slow the ambitions of men who, however well-intentioned, were understood to be fallible. The framers did not trust virtue to endure without structure, nor did they believe power could be safely concentrated in the hands of the confident. Their genius lay in constructing a system that assumed human imperfection and sought to civilize it. In this sense, the Constitution is not merely a legal document but a moral one. It teaches patience by forcing delay, humility by dividing authority, and responsibility by dispersing power. It does not promise efficiency, it promises durability. The modern temptation is to treat these features as defects, to view constitutional friction as obstruction rather than protection, yet history suggests that liberty survives precisely because of these impediments, not despite them. When constitutional language is repurposed as a weapon, it loses its formative power. Invocations of rights divorced from responsibilities transform safeguards into slogans. The Constitution becomes a stage prop rather than a compass, invoked selectively to sanctify one's preferences rather than to discipline one's impulses. In such a climate, reverence gives way to utility, and the document meant to restrain power becomes a tool for its expansion. This shift is particularly dangerous because it masquerades as principle, appeals to liberty. Stripped of context and obligation, can justify nearly anything. But liberty without structure is not freedom, it is volatility. The framers understood that true liberty requires limits, limits imposed not by rulers alone, but by citizens willing to govern themselves. Self-government, after all, presumes selves capable of self-restraint. The erosion of constitutional culture does not begin with open defiance but with casual disregard. When norms are treated as optional, when processes are bypassed for expedience, when outcomes are prized over legitimacy, the republic's moral architecture weakens. Over time, citizens come to expect results without patience and authority without accountability. The Constitution remains, but its animating spirit fades. This is not a call for constitutional idolatry. The document has endured precisely because it allows for amendment, adaptation, and debate. But such flexibility presupposes fidelity, a shared commitment to the rules, even when they frustrate immediate desires. Without that commitment, flexibility curdles into opportunism. The question confronting Americans then is not whether the Constitution can survive moments of stress, it has done so before, but whether citizens still understand its purpose. If it is seen merely as a means to an end, it will eventually be discarded when inconvenient. If it is understood as a moral framework for coexistence, it can continue to guide a diverse and contentious people. A free society endures not because its citizens agree on everything, but because they agree on how to disagree. The Constitution embodies that agreement when it is treated as a shared inheritance rather than a partisan tool. It performs its quiet work of civilizing power. When it is not, the consequences are rarely immediate but always accumulating. The erosion is gradual, patient, and unforgiving, much like the discipline required to prevent it. The health of a republic can often be measured not by the fervor of its debates, but by the quality of its disagreements. A society capable of sustaining disagreement without descending into contempt possesses a moral resource more valuable than any policy triumph. What now threatens that resource is not simply polarization, but the corrosion of moral imagination, the capacity to recognize political opponents as fellow citizens rather than existential adversaries. Civic friendship, as Aristotle understood it, does not require affection or agreement. It requires a shared commitment to the common enterprise of self-government. It is the recognition that political opponents are not enemies to be crushed, but partners in a difficult, ongoing experiment. When that recognition fades, politics becomes a theater of humiliation, and the republic begins to consume itself from within. Contempt is politically efficient but civically ruinous. It simplifies complex realities into moral caricatures, allowing individuals to feel righteous without being reflective. Contempt relieves the burden of persuasion. One need not persuade those deemed irredeemable, yet a democracy cannot function on the assumption that large portions of its citizenry are beyond moral consideration. Such thinking corrodes the very foundation of equal citizenship. The cultural cost of this erosion is profound. When contempt becomes habitual, it reshapes character. Citizens trained to sneer lose the capacity for patience. They confuse moral clarity with moral superiority, and conviction with cruelty. Over time, this posture becomes self-reinforcing. The more one dehumanizes others, the more one must do so to justify past cruelty. What begins as rhetoric hardens into disposition. History offers ample warning. Societies that abandon mutual recognition do not descend into chaos overnight. They drift into a colder, more brittle condition. Institutions persist, elections occur, laws passed, but the spirit animating them grows thin. Civic rituals become hollow, trust evaporates, and public life loses its gravitational center. The result is not tyranny in the classical sense, but a persistent, grinding alienation that leaves citizens isolated within their own certainties. Moral imagination, by contrast, is an act of discipline. It requires the effort to see complexity where slogans beckon, to acknowledge motives without excusing misconduct, and to recognize that political identity is only one dimension of human worth. This discipline does not weaken conviction, it refines it. It anchors belief in humility rather than hubris. A republic worthy of the name depends on citizens capable of such restraint. Laws can compel behavior, but they cannot cultivate character. That work belongs to families, schools, communities, and traditions that teach individuals how to disagree without dehumanizing. When those institutions falter, politics absorbs their failures, and the public square becomes a surrogate battleground for unresolved moral anxieties. The cost of contempt is not borne equally, it falls heaviest on the civic fabric itself, thinning the bonds that make pluralism possible. Over time, citizens cease to see one another as co-authors of a shared future and instead as obstacles to be overcome. At that point, the Republic's greatest danger is not oppression, but indifference, the quiet acceptance of division as destiny. Yet renewal remains possible. Civic culture is not self-sustaining, but it is renewable through deliberate practice. It begins with the refusal to caricature, the willingness to listen, and the discipline to argue without hatred. These are modest acts, but republics are preserved not by grand gestures, but by accumulated habits of restraint. Renewal in a republic rarely arrives as a dramatic reversal, it emerges instead through the quiet reassertion of principles that once seemed ordinary: restraint over impulse, duty over display, stewardship over dominance. For a political tradition often described as conservative, this is not a call to nostalgia but to continuity, to the preservation of conditions that make ordered liberty possible across generations. Conservatism at its best is not an ideology of preservation for its own sake. It is a disposition, a recognition that institutions embody accumulated wisdom and that reform, to endure, must respect the limits of human nature. Edmund Burke's caution against abstract schemes was not a defense of injustice, but a warning against the arrogance that assumes society can be redesigned without cost. Reform, he argued, should resemble pruning rather than demolition. That sensibility remains urgently relevant. In a culture increasingly enamored with disruption, the conservative impulse to conserve can appear timid. Yet restraint is not weakness. It is a form of moral courage that resists the temptation to sacrifice tomorrow for the satisfactions of today. The most durable reforms in American history, from constitutional amendments to civil rights legislation, were achieved not through contempt for institutions but through engagement with them, often over generations. Institutional renewal begins locally and incrementally. It does not depend on charismatic figures or sweeping promises, but on habits of participation that restore trust through practice. Local governance, civic associations, and voluntary institutions remain the training grounds of citizenship. They teach compromise, not as surrender, but as coexistence. They remind citizens that political life is not a performance, but a responsibility. The conservatism worthy of the name must also resist the allure of grievance. Grievance politics flatters. By offering moral innocence without effort, it transforms complex realities into narratives of victimhood and villainy, absolving adherents of the duty to examine their own assumptions. Such politics may mobilize, but it cannot govern. A free society requires citizens who can endure disappointment without demanding domination. Equally important is the recovery of proportion. Not every disagreement is an existential threat, not every election the final reckoning. When politics is experienced as permanent emergency, prudence gives way to panic. The constitutional order, designed to endure across generations, cannot survive perpetual crisis mentality. Stability requires the courage to accept imperfect outcomes within a durable system. Conservatism, properly understood, does not promise utopia, it offers something rarer: continuity without stagnation, change without chaos, freedom anchored by responsibility. It asks citizens to invest in institutions, not because they are flawless, but because they are ours. Such loyalty is not blind, it is discerning, grounded in the belief that improvement is possible only where commitment endures. The renewal of American civic life will not come from louder voices or sharper accusations. It will come from a renewed respect for limits, limits on power, on rhetoric, on the self. In honoring those limits, a society rediscovers the quiet strength that sustains liberty across time. This is not a dramatic prescription, but it is a durable one, and durability, in the end, is the true measure of political success. Citizenship is the final and most demanding office in a republic. It requires no election, confers no title, and offers no applause, yet upon it rests the entire architecture of self-government. Institutions may frame public life, but they cannot animate it. That work belongs to citizens who understand that freedom is not merely the absence of restraint, but the presence of responsibility willingly assumed. A free society endures not because its people agree, but because they accept the discipline of disagreement. This discipline is learned slowly, often imperfectly, and always at some cost. It asks citizens to subordinate impulse to principle, certainty to curiosity, and victory to legitimacy. Such habits are neither natural nor glamorous, yet without them, liberty becomes unsustainable, consumed by the very passions it unleashes. The American experiment has always depended on this quiet ethic. The founders did not expect unanimity, nor did they imagine virtue to be universal. They hoped instead for a citizenry capable of self-correction, people who could recognize error without humiliation and change course without repudiating their identity. That capacity is not inherited automatically, it must be cultivated anew in each generation. In an age saturated with noise, the temptation is to mistake volume for influence and outrage for engagement, but democratic vitality is not measured by decibels. It is measured by the willingness of citizens to think before reacting, to listen before condemning, and to weigh consequences before demanding change. These habits rarely trend on social media, yet they remain the bedrock of durable self-rule. The preservation of liberty, then, is not a matter of finding the right leader or winning the next contest. It is a daily practice of restraint, humility, and moral seriousness. It requires citizens who resist the seductions of certainty and instead embrace the harder work of judgment. It calls for an understanding that political opponents are not obstacles to be eliminated, but fellow participants in an unfinished project